Picture the last time someone made you feel small, and then wonder why, a few hours later, you were apologizing to them. If that sentence landed somewhere familiar, you are not alone. In fact, you might be one of the hundreds of millions of people who have, at some point in their lives, found themselves in a relationship that quietly took more than it gave. That left them smaller, quieter, more unsure, and somehow convinced that this was their own doing. Tonight, we're going into one of the most thoroughly researched and most personally relevant territories in all of psychology: the science of toxic relationships. Not the dramatic movie version kind, the real kind. The one that can sit inside a perfectly ordinary life and be nearly invisible to everyone, including the person living it. But here's the thing most people don't expect when they start reading the research on this topic, and it's the piece that changes everything. The most dangerous feature of a toxic relationship isn't the person causing harm. It's the way the brain, when wired by love and attachment, actively works to keep you from seeing clearly. That's where we'll begin, with the brain. Because that's where this story really starts. Let yourself settle. Breathe slowly. We have time. The word gets used so freely now that it can feel vague. A catch-all for anyone difficult, any relationship disappointing. But when psychology uses the word, it is pointing at something precise. A relationship is considered psychologically toxic when its consistent patterns of interaction cause measurable harm, emotional, psychological, physical, or some combination, to one or more of the people in it. Not occasional harm. Not the normal friction that exists in every human bond. Sustained, patterned harm that accumulates over time and reshapes the person experiencing it. The research foundation here comes largely from the work of Dr. John Gottman, a mathematician turned psychologist, who spent over 4 decades studying couples at the University of Washington in what became known as his Love Lab. Over the course of his research, which ultimately followed more than 3,000 couples, Gottman identified 4 behavioral patterns that, when consistently present, predicted relationship failure with around 90 to 94% accuracy, depending on the study. He called them the 4 horsemen. They are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Of these, Gottman identified contempt as the most corrosive by far. Contempt isn't simply frustration or anger. It is the communication, through words, through tone, through gesture, that the other person is inferior, ridiculous, or worthy of scorn. It is mockery, eye-rolling, sarcasm used as a weapon, and a persistent positioning of oneself above the other. What makes contempt particularly striking in the research is that it predicted not only relationship dissolution, but also measurable changes in the physical health of the person receiving it. The stress response it triggers, Gottman's work suggested, is not occasional. It is relentless. Beyond Gottman's framework, other clinical definitions of relational toxicity extend into the territory of coercive control, a concept formalized significantly through the work of Evan Stark, a sociologist and forensic social worker whose 2007 book on coercive control became a landmark in understanding relational harm. Stark's central argument was that in many harmful relationships, physical violence is only one element, and often not even the primary one. The more pervasive mechanism, he argued, is a pattern of domination, monitoring, isolating, manipulating, and gradually stripping away a person's autonomy until independent thought feels impossible. This is the clinical foundation, and what it tells us from the outset is this: toxic relationships do not require dramatic events. They can be built slowly and quietly out of contempt, dismissal, and the gradual narrowing of someone's world. Here is something that tends to surprise people. The formal study of harmful intimate relationships is, in historical terms, quite new. For most of recorded history, what happened inside a relationship, particularly a marriage, was considered private, social, beyond the reach of science or law. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that psychology began turning its lens toward the home. One of the earliest pivotal moments came with the work of Lenore Walker, a psychologist who in 1979 published The Battered Woman, one of the first clinical texts to take intimate partner violence seriously as a psychological phenomenon, rather than a social problem at the margins. Walker's most enduring contribution was what she called the cycle of abuse. In its original formulation, she described 3 recurring phases she observed in abusive relationships: a tension-building stage, an acute incident of violence or harm, and a honeymoon or reconciliation phase, a period of tenderness, apology, and the temporary return of the person the partner had fallen in love with. This cycle, Walker argued, helped explain something that outsiders frequently found baffling: why people in abusive relationships so often return, forgive, and defend their partners. The reconciliation phase is not incidental. It creates a powerful psychological hook: the hope that the tender person from the reconciliation is the true person, and the harmful one was the exception. As we'll see shortly, the neuroscience behind this hope is more sophisticated than it might appear. Walker also applied Martin Seligman's concept of learned helplessness to intimate partner violence. In 1967, Seligman and his colleague Stephen Mayer had conducted a now famous series of experiments at the University of Pennsylvania in which dogs were exposed to unavoidable electric shocks. When later placed in environments where escape was possible, the dogs, who had previously experienced inescapable shock, largely did not attempt to flee. They had learned, through repeated experience, that their actions made no difference. Seligman called this phenomenon learned helplessness. Walker, drawing on this work, proposed that chronic exposure to unpredictable harm in an intimate relationship could produce a similar psychological state in humans, one in which leaving feels not merely difficult, but cognitively inconceivable. The field continued to develop. In 1995, sociologist Michael Johnson published research that fundamentally changed how researchers and clinicians categorized intimate partner violence. His work drew a crucial distinction between what he called intimate terrorism, violence embedded in a systematic campaign of coercive control, with one partner using multiple tactics to dominate the other, and what he called situational couple violence, which arises from specific conflicts escalating without an underlying pattern of control. This distinction matters enormously in practice. It helps explain why some couples can benefit from conflict-focused therapy, while for others, that same approach could be genuinely dangerous. The research kept expanding, and what emerged across all of it was a picture far more complex than the cultural narrative of toxic relationships had allowed for. Now here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't see coming. The neuroscience of love and the neuroscience of chronic stress are not opposites. In several critical ways, they share the same pathways. And understanding this is probably the single most important piece of this entire conversation. When we form a powerful attachment to another person, the brain undergoes a cascade of neurochemical events. Dopamine, the brain's primary reward signal, surges, creating feelings of pleasure, anticipation, and motivation. Oxytocin rises during moments of physical and emotional intimacy, creating feelings of warmth and trust. Helen Fisher, a biological anthropologist at Rutgers University, conducted landmark neuroimaging studies in the early 2000s in which she placed people in MRI machines and showed them photographs of their romantic partners. The resulting brain scans showed activation primarily in the ventral tegmental area and the caudate nucleus, regions associated with reward and dopamine processing. Her finding was striking. Love functions in the brain less like an emotion and more like a drive, as fundamental and motivating as hunger. So far, this applies to any love. The important question is, what happens when that love is attached to someone unpredictable? Here is where the neuroscience becomes uncomfortable. When a relationship cycles between warmth and cruelty, between tenderness and contempt, between closeness and rejection, the brain responds to the unpredictability itself. And unpredictability, in neurological terms, is one of the most powerful drivers of dopamine release that exists. This is the mechanism behind intermittent reinforcement, a principle rooted in B.F. Skinner's behavioral research from the mid-20th century. In his experiments, Skinner found that rewards delivered on an unpredictable schedule produced the most persistent and compulsive behavior, far more so than rewards delivered consistently. Slot machines are designed on this exact principle. And so, based on what we know from the neuroscience, we can understand what happens in a relationship where warmth and cruelty alternate without warning. The brain is being trained to compulsively seek the reward, the warmth, the approval, the connection, precisely because it comes unpredictably. The relationship becomes, in a neurological sense, the most compelling thing in the person's environment. Alongside this, chronic relational stress activates the body's threat response. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, remains persistently elevated. Over time, this affects nearly every system in the body: immune function, cardiovascular health, sleep architecture, memory, and emotional regulation. The amygdala, the brain's primary alarm center, becomes hyperactivated. And here is perhaps the most important implication of all. A nervous system under chronic relational stress can gradually recalibrate. It can begin to experience the absence of crisis as anxiety rather than as calm. Because it has adapted to constant alertness, stillness starts to feel wrong. This is why Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, a psychiatrist and trauma researcher, argued in his influential body of work that trauma is not just stored in the mind. It is stored in the body, in physiological reactivity, in the baseline tone of the nervous system, in the way we hold ourselves in space. Recovery, then, is never simply a matter of changing one's thoughts. The healing has to reach the body. It has to reach the places where the story was stored before it had words. Not every toxic relationship looks the same from the outside. Some are loud, characterized by open conflict and dramatic confrontations. Others are almost eerily quiet, defined by subtle erasure and the slow disappearance of one person's sense of self. But across the research, certain patterns appear with enough consistency that they've become central to how clinicians identify toxic relational dynamics. The first is chronic criticism and contempt. Consistent, repeated attacks on a person's character, not on their behavior, but on who they are, that gradually become internalized. The external voice becomes the internal one. The second is gaslighting. The term comes from a 1938 play by Patrick Hamilton, in which a husband systematically manipulates his wife into doubting her own perception of reality. In clinical usage, gaslighting refers to a pattern of persistent reality distortion, denying what happened, reframing events, causing the other person to distrust their own memory and judgment. Clinical psychologist Robin Stern described in her 2007 work how gaslighting rarely begins loudly. It begins with small moments of reality correction that gradually expand. The third is isolation, whether physical, restricting access to friends and family, or more subtle, in which the person comes to feel that no one outside the relationship truly understands them. Isolation is consistently identified in the research as one of the most dangerous features of controlling relationships because it removes the external reference points that might otherwise offer clarity. The fourth is emotional unpredictability, the cycling of moods and availability that keeps the other person in a state of constant vigilance. This doesn't always mean explosive anger. It can be long periods of cold withdrawal alternating with warmth. The unpredictability is the mechanism. It keeps the partner's attention focused almost entirely on managing the relationship's emotional climate. The fifth is love bombing. Periods of overwhelming affection and attention, often appearing early in a relationship or after periods of harm, that create a rapid and intense attachment. Whether it occurs consciously or not, this accelerated bonding becomes a powerful psychological anchor even after the relationship's tone changes significantly. The sixth is invalidation, the consistent dismissal of the other person's feelings, perceptions, and needs. Over time, this teaches the recipient that their inner life is unreliable, that their feelings are problems rather than information. The seventh is blame shifting and lack of accountability, the pattern by which conflict and harm are consistently reattributed to the person being hurt. Combined with gaslighting, this creates a closed loop in which the person experiencing harm cannot access a coherent narrative about what is happening to them. These patterns rarely appear alone. They interlock and reinforce each other, and together they create a relational environment in which one person's sense of reality, self-worth, and identity is gradually and systematically diminished. This is the part of the conversation that tends to provoke the most discomfort. Not because the answer is complicated, but because it is so deeply, uncomplicatedly human. The question most people ask is, why don't people just leave? The research asks us to first notice that this question frames the situation incorrectly. It places the burden of explanation on the person experiencing harm, rather than on the mechanisms of harm itself or the systems that fail to intervene. But understanding why leaving feels impossible, or genuinely dangerous, is essential. The first mechanism is learned helplessness. When someone's repeated attempts to improve their situation, to be heard, to set limits, or to leave have been consistently blocked or punished, the nervous system arrives at a kind of defeated stillness, not passivity from weakness, passivity from learning. The second is cognitive dissonance. Leon Festinger's landmark work in 1957 demonstrated that humans are deeply motivated to resolve the discomfort of holding two conflicting beliefs simultaneously, and that we most often do so by changing our beliefs rather than our behavior. In a toxic relationship, the conflict is, this person is hurting me, and this person loves me, and I love them, and my whole life is built around this. Resolving that dissonance by minimizing the harm, deciding it wasn't so bad, that it was partially one's own fault, feels in the moment like relief. The third is the sunk cost effect, documented extensively in behavioral economics through the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the 1970s. Humans are loss averse. We are psychologically prone to continuing investment in something, a relationship, a path, because of what we have already put in, even when stepping away would be objectively better. The more years, sacrifices, and identity we've woven into a relationship, the harder the loss of leaving becomes to absorb psychologically. Then there are the practical realities: economic dependence, shared children, housing, immigration status, social networks that would dissolve. Researcher Jacqueline Campbell at Johns Hopkins has extensively documented that the period immediately following departure from a controlling relationship is statistically among the most dangerous for the person leaving. This is why safety planning, careful, individualized, realistic safety planning, is considered essential by experts in this field, rather than a simple instruction to leave. And beneath all of this is something quieter, and perhaps the most human of all: hope. Hope that the warmth that existed early in the relationship, or that still appears during reconciliation, is the real person. That the harm is the aberration. That love is enough. Psychology doesn't dismiss this hope as naive. It recognizes it as the most natural response in the world to the person you love, and it asks us to hold profound compassion for it. Here is something the most careful research in this field asks us to hold, even when it's uncomfortable. Not every toxic relationship involves one clear perpetrator and one clear victim who are fixed in those roles. This is not said to excuse harm. Harm is harm, regardless of context. But it is said in service of accuracy, because accuracy, ultimately, is what makes healing possible. The Cartman Drama Triangle, a social model introduced by psychiatrist Stephen Cartman in 1968, describes a relational dynamic in which people in conflict occupy three shifting roles: persecutor, victim, and rescuer. What made this model enduring was Cartman's observation that these roles are not fixed. People move between them. The person experiencing harm may, in certain moments, become the one causing it. The one identified as the aggressor may experience themselves as the real victim. The rescuer may slide into control. This doesn't mean harm is symmetrical. It often isn't. But it does suggest that some harmful relationships involve both partners contributing to a dynamic that neither fully sees, and that both may have learned communication patterns from their earliest relationships that are genuinely maladaptive. Both may have unprocessed wounds playing out in the partnership, each person's responses triggering the other's deepest fears. There is also context. A relationship that functions adequately under low-stress conditions can become genuinely toxic under the pressure of financial crisis, illness, or grief. Someone who behaves harmfully in a relationship may simultaneously be a person struggling with untreated depression, unprocessed trauma, or a psychological structure shaped by significant early adversity. This situates harm within a fuller human picture, not to excuse it, but to understand it, because understanding it is what makes change possible. There is a question clinical psychology returns to again and again in the study of adult relationships. Why do people so often find themselves in relationships that mirror their earliest experiences, even when those early experiences caused harm? The answer lives largely in attachment theory, one of the most thoroughly researched frameworks in developmental psychology. John Bowlby, a British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, developed attachment theory in the 1950s and 60s through his study of how children respond to separation from caregivers. His central argument was that humans are biologically primed to seek proximity to attachment figures, and that the quality of early attachment creates what he called an internal working model, a largely unconscious template through which all future relationships are understood. Mary Ainsworth's strange situation experiment, conducted in 1969, identified distinct attachment styles. Emerging from this template, secure attachment, in which children felt confident in their caregiver's availability; anxious/ambivalent attachment, in which children were hypervigilant and distressed by even brief separation; and avoidant attachment, in which children had learned to emotionally self-contain as an adaptation to unavailable caregiving. In 1986, Mary Main and Judith Solomon identified a fourth style, disorganized attachment, observed in children whose caregivers were simultaneously a source of comfort and a source of fear. This particular style is strongly associated in the subsequent research with early experiences of abuse or severe neglect, and consistently linked to the highest rates of difficulty in adult relationships. The reason, as best as the research can explain, is this: when the very person who is supposed to provide safety is also the source of threat, the attachment system has no coherent strategy. It cannot approach and cannot flee. What results is disorganization, a fragmented relational blueprint that follows the person into adulthood. The ACE study, conducted by researchers Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda in collaboration between Kaiser Permanente and the CDC from 1995 to 1997, with over 17,000 participants, documented the long-term effects of adverse childhood experiences in striking detail. The study found what it called dose-response relationships. The more categories of adverse childhood experiences a person had been exposed to, the stronger their risk of a wide range of negative outcomes across adulthood, including vulnerability to harmful relationships. The finding suggests something that feels both obvious and important once stated. Children who learn that love comes with unpredictability, fear, or the need to manage another person's emotional state in order to survive carry that learning forward. Familiar patterns, even painful ones, can feel more like safety than the unfamiliar terrain of a genuinely steady relationship. Freud described this tendency as repetition compulsion. Later theorists have debated the concept at length, but the underlying observation that our earliest relational experiences shape our attraction patterns, our conflict responses, and our tolerance for various kinds of treatment is well supported across decades of clinical and developmental research. When someone has been inside a toxic relationship for not weeks but months, years, sometimes decades, the effects are not only emotional, they are neurological, physiological. They are changes in the architecture of the self. The clinical concept most relevant here is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. While standard PTSD, as defined in the DSM-5, is typically associated with discrete traumatic events, CPTSD describes the effects of prolonged, repeated trauma, particularly trauma that is relational in nature and from which the person could not easily escape. It was first formally proposed by Judith Herman in 1992 and has since been included in the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases published by the World Health Organization. Beyond the standard trauma symptoms, intrusion, avoidance, hyperarousal, CPTSD is associated with specific disturbances in how a person organizes their sense of self, persistent feelings of being worthless, broken, or fundamentally different from other people, difficulty with emotional regulation, and ongoing challenges in relationships. These aren't personality traits. They are, based on what we understand from the neuroscience, adaptations to sustained relational threat. Neuroimaging research suggests that prolonged trauma exposure is associated with measurable changes in the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala, regions involved in memory, executive function, and threat detection, respectively. These changes affect not only how a person responds to stress in the aftermath of leaving, but how they experience relationships, safety, and their own identity going forward. Perhaps the quietest and most pervasive effect is identity erosion. When someone has spent years having their perceptions corrected, their interests dismissed, their friendships questioned, and their self-expression met with contempt or indifference, the inner self can become very quiet. People who have exited long-term toxic relationships frequently describe not knowing what they like anymore, not knowing who they are outside the relationship, not trusting their own judgment, even on small, daily decisions. This is not weakness. Based on everything the research tells us, it is the predictable outcome of having one's inner life consistently treated as unreliable. Physically, the effects compound over time. Sustained cortisol elevation affects immune function, sleep architecture, cardiovascular health, and the inflammatory signaling systems of the body. Research by Janice Kiecolt-Glaser and colleagues, published in 2013, found that relational hostility was directly measurable in inflammatory biomarkers, meaning that the quality of our close relationships shows up in the body's immune signaling in real and quantifiable ways. Recovery from a toxic relationship is one of the more demanding processes in human psychology. Not because it is impossible. It is not. But because it requires healing at multiple levels simultaneously. The mind, the body, the story a person tells about themselves. Several therapeutic approaches have substantial evidence behind them for supporting this recovery. EMDR, eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing, was developed by psychologist Francine Shapiro in 1987 and has since been extensively studied. It involves processing traumatic memories through bilateral stimulation while holding the memory in mind, and has repeatedly demonstrated effectiveness for PTSD, and trauma-related symptoms in clinical trials. Somatic therapies, approaches that work directly with the body's experience of trauma, including somatic experiencing, developed by Peter Levine, address what purely talk-based approaches can miss: the embodied, physiological dimension of relational harm. These approaches are built on the principle that trauma is stored in the nervous system and must be discharged through the body, not only narrated. Attachment-based therapy addresses the deeper patterns, the internal working models formed in childhood that may have shaped vulnerability to harmful relationships. By providing a consistent, honest, and genuinely safe therapeutic relationship, it offers something that is itself healing: the lived experience of a relationship in which one is reliably seen, responded to with care, and free to be imperfect. Beyond formal therapy, the research is consistent on one thing: social reconnection matters enormously, not just emotionally, neurobiologically. The social engagement system of the nervous system, as Stephen Porges described in his polyvagal theory, is directly involved in the regulation of stress and the sense of safety. Being genuinely in the presence of warm, consistent, trustworthy people does not merely feel comforting. It signals to the nervous system that the threat is over, that it can begin to rest. Rebuilding the self after a toxic relationship is often described by survivors as a process of rediscovery. Rediscovering interests that were suppressed or dismissed. Rediscovering a relationship with one's own preferences, instincts, and voice. The inner voice that knows what it thinks and feels and wants, separate from anyone else's version of it. This process can feel tentative and strange at first. It asks for patience. It asks for permission. It asks for the same quality of gentle attention one would give to something new and fragile. Researchers Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, working in the mid-1990s, developed the concept of post-traumatic growth, the observation that a significant portion of people who have experienced major life crises, including relational trauma, report not just recovery, but a deepening, greater clarity about their values, richer compassion for others, and a more authentic relationship with themselves. This is not said to minimize harm. It is said because it is true, and because truth, in this context, matters. One of the most important questions that arises on the far side of recovery is this: how do I know what healthy looks like now? After years of a nervous system calibrated to alertness, a relationship that is genuinely calm can feel wrong. It can feel like something is missing, like the quietness means the other person doesn't care, rather than that they do. This dissonance between what the nervous system expects and what genuine safety actually feels like is one of the more disorienting aspects of early recovery. The research doesn't describe healthy relationships as those without conflict. Gottman's decades of work identified what he called the masters of relationships, couples who were not those with the least conflict, but those with a ratio of around 5 positive interactions for everyone, -1, and those who could repair after conflict without contempt, without prolonged silence, and with genuine bids for reconnection. The features the research consistently identifies as foundational to relational health include mutual respect, a baseline regard for each other's personhood, and autonomy that doesn't waver during conflict, consistency, not rigidity, but reliability, knowing that a person's warmth does not depend on your performance, safety, the felt sense that disagreement, imperfection, and honesty are survivable within the relationship, and reciprocity, the experience that care and effort move in both directions, even if not always identically. Research on what attachment theorists call earned security, developed by Mary Main and colleagues, is perhaps the most quietly hopeful finding in this entire area. Even individuals who experienced significant insecurity or disruption in early attachment can develop a secure relationship with attachment across adulthood through meaningful, positive relational experiences. The brain retains plasticity. Patterns can shift. The internal working model, which was written in childhood and reinforced in subsequent relationships, can be slowly and genuinely rewritten by new experience. Trust your own perceptions. After a long time of being told that your inner experience is wrong, unreliable, or excessive, the act of listening to yourself is not self-indulgence. It is not paranoia. It is recovery. Your feelings are information. Your discomfort is information. Your ease is information too. And learning to treat that information as valid, rather than as something to be immediately second-guessed, may be one of the most important things recovery asks of you. Tonight, we have traveled a long way together, through the neuroscience of love and stress, through the history of how psychology arrived at its current understanding of relational harm, through the patterns that define toxic dynamics and the mechanisms that make them so difficult to exit, through the childhood blueprints we carry forward, the body's record of what it has endured, and the long, non-linear road towards something different. If you have been in a toxic relationship, if you are still in one, or somewhere in the middle of leaving, or long past it and still carrying what it left, please know that what happened to you was not evidence of your failure. The research is extraordinarily clear on this. The dynamics that draw people into and keep people within harmful relationships exploit the most genuine parts of us: our capacity for love, our hope, our loyalty, our longing for connection. None of these are weaknesses. They are the very best of being human. The goal, in the end, is not to become invulnerable, not to build walls around the heart so high that nothing harmful can reach it, and nothing real can either. The goal is to understand yourself clearly enough, and to develop genuine enough respect for your own inner life that you can remain open while also remaining anchored. Knowing who you are, knowing what you need, knowing what you will and will not accept. Wholeness is the word, not armor, not perfection. Wholeness. The capacity to hold all of it, your history, your patterns, your healing, your hope, and to move forward anyway, gently, one step at a time. Let your breathing slow now. Let your body settle. The night is here, so you are safe. If anything tonight has been meaningful to you, a like goes a long way. It helps others find this space. And if you'd like to keep exploring the quiet corners of human psychology, we'd love to have you subscribe and stay. Rest well.